Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Our guest today is a professor at the City University of New York, John Jay University School of Criminal Justice. Her name is Debi Koetzle. She's also the author or co-author of What Works and What Doesn't in Reducing Recidivism. Professor Koetzle, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about, because the book that I read of yours is the Recidivism book. So before we can get into what causes recidivism, what exactly is recidivism?
Well, that's a great question. I'm not sure that I have an exact answer, right? I think generally speaking, when we talk about recidivism, at least in academic circles, or if I'm talking with practitioners, it's really this idea of getting into trouble again, right? We know there's a lot of problems with that definition. We can measure it as being rearrested, but there's a lot of police discretion that goes on. We can measure it as being convicted, right? Which assumes then some degree of culpability, but we also know our system is not infallible. If we're talking about recidivism rates of people that exited prison, we sometimes will talk about going back to prison. So it can be measured a lot of different ways, but I think generally speaking, this idea of breaking the law again.
So somebody that returns to breaking the law after a period where they were prevented from doing so, whether it be in a prison or a halfway house drug program, something along those lines, right?
Sure. Or they just didn't, right? For a period of time. They
Yeah.
just did not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So even if somebody just refrained from a while and then went back, okay. So in the context that we're talking about, because I was in prison and I'm trying to help to change the prison system, that's what I want to talk about. So the first concept I kind of want to cover with you is core correctional practices. So what are core correctional practices?
Yeah, it's a great question. So ultimately, I think I would boil down core correctional practices is saying that the people that are working in prison, whether it's a correctional officer, whether it's a case manager, whether it's someone providing treatment services of whatever sort, that we need to work with people in a way that provides respect, in a way that offers choices, autonomy, in a way that allows us to build relationships with people and helps people to engage in problem solving and skill development rather than trying to work with people from an incredibly punitive or authoritative approach.
So if I remember correctly, some of the core correctional practices were effective use of authority, effective use of punishment, modeling, basically that everybody that works in a facility is responsible for creating the type of environment that's going to be conducive for the offender to change. So when an officer or anybody that works in the prison, for instance, is setting a bad example, they're modeling poor behavior. And I know from experience being in prison that what ends up happening is the inmates say, well, look, they do the same thing. Everybody's just like me. I just happen to get caught. And especially in the context of programming, it turns into a nightmare because you end up having to defend this prison system or try to explain why it doesn't matter, when ultimately in the mind of the person making the claim, it does. And the punishment aspect of it, for instance, like in prison, the punishments or the rule enforcement is very inconsistent, right? So punishment, how would effective punishment work?
Mm. I have all kinds of PowerPoint slides. I should have pulled them up. So, I just want to say you're right about this issue of how we work with people. That if we're modeling or sending messages that you can't change, that you're not worth anything, that this doesn't matter, that it's okay to do drugs as long as it's just me doing drugs and not you, why would we expect people to be responsive to any type of treatment, right?
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right on that. In terms of effective punishment, one, I think it's really important that people sort of know what to expect, right? That it's not inconsistent, that it's not, well, today I'm allowed to do this, but now tomorrow I'm not. That we know that we're clear in what we're responding to, that if a correctional officer, or again, a case manager, is responding to some behavior, that behavior is clear, right? And it's clear that we're responding to the behavior and not the individual, right? That we talk about, okay, what is the problem with this behavior? Why is this an issue? But also, I think really importantly, and what I don't think we ever do, or at least not frequently, is how do we avoid this? Right? So if you're late showing up for work on a consistent basis, and now you're going to lose your job, and maybe there's punishment as a result of that, well, why are you showing up late for work? What's the issue that we need to address so that you can be successful? And that's not punishment in and of itself, right? That's really more about skill building. But once there has been some sort of punishment issued, we need to stop that punishment and turn towards, how do we do better? How do we fix it in the future?
Right.
Right?
So
Yelling and
yeah.
screaming at people, right? Telling them they're idiots, telling them they're wrong doesn't do anything to change anything.
No, so what we'd want ideally is so there's be a clear connection between the problem behavior and the punishment administered, an explanation of why it's wrong, and then an explanation of how to move forward in a more pro-social manner, right?
That's
But
right.
and just as important would be, right, is that good behavior ought to be rewarded.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's have a broad definition of good behavior.
Okay.
Right. That good behavior is not always going over and above what's expected, but sometimes good behavior is doing what is expected. If you have young children, right, you want to reward the good behavior because that's the behavior that they engage in, right? That's the behavior that they repeat. And so within a correctional setting, we want to reward or reinforce, right? That's really what we're doing, is reinforcing the good behavior. So if that is getting up on time, and these are small, silly things, but in juvenile facilities, sometimes having your bed made, sometimes really small things that we want to reinforce and say, yeah, you're doing good here, because that can help to build a sense of self-efficacy. As people are making progress and changing, we want to start focusing on rewarding those bigger issues, right? Or the bigger successes, the bigger changes. And we want those rewards to become more intermittent over time, because ultimately what we want is for people to feel reinforced for doing a good thing, right? That it's coming from inside versus always external.
There's a story I always like to tell because to me, it's typical of prison life, and it really exemplifies everything that I've ever talked about. My cellmate and I, we used to work in the industries at the prison we were in. And so when you come back from work, there's two tiers. One tier would be out for rec, the other tier wouldn't. And if your tier wasn't out for rec, you were supposed to get on a shower list, lock up, and then they would let you out when your turn came up. So inevitably, he and I would be the only two that would get on the shower list. Nobody else would obey, and nothing would happen to them. They would just get to hang out, have extra rec that they weren't supposed to have, get their shower ahead of time. And meanwhile, we were the two that did what we were supposed to, and we were de facto being punished. And I just can't think of any more sort of disastrous method of operations inside a prison when you're trying to teach people to behave the way that you want them to behave.
That's right. That's right. And that's a great example. I mean, that inconsistency, right? Or that punishment for doing what you're being asked to do is really unfair. And it sends the message to other people that I don't have to follow the rules. I can
Right.
do whatever I want because it doesn't matter.
Yeah. And why bother? The two jabronis that obeyed the rules are locked in their cells, showering last, and all the other guys are showering, hanging out, playing chess, cards, whatever. So a big part of the to rehabilitate offenders is the programming that is implemented within prisons. So it's called evidence-based programming is how it's often referred to. So what are some examples of evidence-based program? I mean, how does it work? What would be the ideal sort of programming that would be implemented in the prison system?
Yeah. So part of that would be everything that we just talked about, right? That it's not just an individual group or an individual service, but it's really the environment. So having an environment that treats people with dignity, that treats people with respect, that gives them some degree of autonomy, that's reinforcing positive behaviors and being consistent in the response to negative behaviors, right? That's what we're trying to do within a particular group then, right? The treatment unit, let's say. One, we want to make sure that we're targeting factors that actually relate to the likelihood of recidivism. So I have visited a lot of institutions over the years, both men's and women's, and I'm always astounded, particularly in the women's institutions, when women are being given art therapy, right? They're journaling, they've got glitter, construction paper, and it's a great activity. I can't draw a straight line, right? That's not what sort of leads someone to trouble, right? So let's make sure we're focusing on those things that can make a difference in terms of staying out of trouble again. But then the second piece of that is making sure that we're providing services in a way that is consistent with the evidence. And what that generally means is using a behavioral or a cognitive behavioral approach, right? When I interview people in prison, and I'll sometimes ask, what is it that you need to do to stay out of trouble? Right? When you leave here, what do you need to do to avoid coming back? And inevitably, one of the answers, if not the dominant answer, is I need new friends. Right? We all know this, like, not a surprise. Making new friends is difficult, right? Identifying between old friends and new friends, being able to say no to your old friends when they're, you get out and they want to celebrate. How do you have fun in pro-social ways? There's a lot of skills that go into that process of making new friends. And for some people, it's also an issue of changing their thinking, right? That you can have fun without using, you can have fun without drugs, you can have fun, in what maybe previously you thought were kind of boring activities. And so a good program or a good group is going to really help people to identify some of these high risk situations for them, teach them concrete skills, whether that's a social skill, a coping skill, or a thinking skill, give them opportunities to practice, give them feedback on that practice, and have them do that again and again so that they're really learning new behaviors versus just talking hypothetically about what would I do different.
So you mentioned two things. You said you want to address the factors that are actually associated with crime, and you want to do it within a framework of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? So the way that I kind of try to explain this to people when I talk to them is that cognitive therapy addresses thought distortions, magnification, minimization, there's a bunch of other ones, personalization, things of that nature. So you use the cognitive behavioral therapy to show somebody the errors that they're committing in thinking. Now, with the criminal, you have a different set of thought distortions that are taking place, or what Dr. Samenow and Yokelson called thinking errors, but often it's called, the technical term now is criminogenic needs, right? So you want to use the cognitive behavioral therapy to address the criminogenic needs of the offender. Would that be an accurate way to state it?
Yeah, I would go a little bit broader. So your thinking patterns could be one criminogenic need, right? So, if your thoughts sort of predispose you to, well, he looked at me wrong, so he deserved to be hit, right? There's a thought distortion happening there, or a thinking
Yes.
error, whatever we want to call it. But there is some thinking that we need to change, because if we can change that thinking, right, we can start to change the outcomes. So that's definitely the cognitive piece of it, is looking at that link between our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. The behavioral piece of it goes a little bit, well, I don't want to say further, but sort of complements that to say that how we teach people, right? How people learn is through doing to some extent. And so if you think about teaching someone to ride a bike, to learn how to ride a bike, you got to practice it,
Yes.
right? You have to do it. And so part of that behavioral component of programs, and what I think often is missing or done poorly, is the practicing, right? That we model these skills, we model new ways of thinking, but we also model concrete skills, right? How do you say no to someone in a way that's not aggressive, right?
Sure.
That's a skill.
Yeah.
How do you make the decision that this is bad for me or good for me? How do you problem solve? Those are all skills that we can use behavioral techniques to help shape.
So what are some examples of the criminogenic needs or the factors that are associated with recidivism?
Yeah. So obviously one of the ones that we often talk about are attitudes, right? That if your thinking is supportive of crime, if your thoughts are supportive of drug use, that predicts the likelihood that you're going to engage in those behaviors again. Um, Substance use is often, well, is a criminogenic need, right? The link between substance use and crime can be complicated. It's not always the same pattern for people, right? The
Sure.
relationship can look very different, but we definitely know that there's a relationship between, having a substance use disorder and engaging in criminal activity. Our friends who we associate with, right? My behavior changes depending on which peer group I'm with.
Sure.
And so if someone has all friends that are engaged in the criminal justice system and still actively engaged, right? Still supportive of crime, then we need to disrupt that network and replace it with better influences. Um, Personality characteristics, right? So, impulsivity is associated with recidivism. Poor verbal intelligence sometimes is associated. If I can't communicate well, and I also happen to have criminal thinking, right, that then might mean when I'm frustrated, I punch because I don't know how else to express myself.
Sure.
Um, a number of personality characteristics, and then things like education, employment, family, right? All of those um, pieces of our lives that provide opportunities for pro-social modeling, for pro-social influences, for pro-social rewards, right? Feeling good about working hard and accomplishing something. If we're not engaged in those types of activities, one, we have a whole lot of free time, and two, we're missing out on that socialization process. So
So
I
to,
think I
to
hit all of them.
you did. So so I can try to summarize, the
Yeah.
ideal programming within a prison setting would be cognitive behavioral therapy addressed to these criminogenic needs, meaning in essence that you want to teach the criminal, the offender, how to think and behave in a pro-social manner. And you do that by guiding him through the thought process and teaching him new effective behaviors, right?
Yep.
Now,
Yep. That would make a big difference.
there's also we call you call correctional quackery, right? And you gave the you didn't call it that, but the example earlier, the art therapy. So two programs that I've experienced in prison, one I took, the other I didn't. But the one actually this one was referred to in I was at a hearing recently where they were confirming the parole and commutation board here in Connecticut. And the guy that was testifying said, these guys in prison, they get to, they're being rehabilitated. They're participating in the dog training program. And I'm just thinking of like, that has nothing, zero to do with recidivism. But yet they tout this program like it's like a big thing that they have this dog training program. And I'm not against having the dog training program. Don't get me wrong. Train dogs. Well, what do I care? But don't present it as if you're helping somebody to alter their criminal behavior. That's true, right? Like there's no evidence that dog training is helping somebody be a non-crook, right?
No, not to my knowledge, but it's super popular, right? Because it
Yeah,
sounds good and it feels good and
sure.
it looks nice on TV. But there's no evidence that that alone, right, is going to make a difference long term for someone who has a likelihood of reoffending,
Yeah.
right? Now, if you've got someone in prison who, first of all, shouldn't be in prison, they're there, they've made a mistake, they're, pretty pro-social in their thinking, their orientation, maybe the dog thing is good, right? Because it's something to do. And definitely activities are good, right? We want to keep people busy,
Sure.
give people something other than sitting around. But that alone for someone who has an array of criminogenic needs should not be expected to have any impact on recidivism.
Now, another program that we have here in Connecticut, it's actually a worldwide program, but it's implemented here in Connecticut. It's highly advocated. It's mandated for a lot of people. Have you ever heard of the Alternative to Violence program? It's actually Alternative to Violence Project.
I don't know that I've heard of that one. I think a lot of states probably have some variation of the same.
Okay, so some of the things that they teach are that our society is a racist, oppressive society. So you're reinforcing the victim idea that's already in the criminal's minds. They have a concept called transforming power, which is basically a higher power that's going to come to your aid to help you out in situations. They teach us that we're all inherently good people. And to me, like all the evidence that I've seen tells me that these are the very things you don't want to be telling criminals. You don't want to tell somebody that's a murderer or a rapist that you're a great guy despite what you've done. Because then you just end up with a guy that's doing bad things but feels good about himself. And as far as having sort of eclectic or not eclectic, esoteric idea of transforming power that's going to come to your aid, it just seems silly to me. And it's also only a 3-day program. So you go for 4 hours, 12 hours, 6 hours, or something like that. I forget the exact way it breaks down, but it's not long enough to have any impact. And many of the things that they teach there seem detrimental. Like the things that I've just described, and I know you don't know, but assuming I'm telling the truth, would those things seem like anything that is going to rehabilitate a chronic or a lifestyle offender?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important for people to have hope, right? I think it's if we're asking people to change their behavior, we need to express a belief that they're capable of changing
Sure.
their behavior.
I agree with that 100%.
So instilling that sense of you are a human being who has value for the very fact that you're a human being,
I agree
right?
with that
So I'm
too.
going to take
Yes.
that positive piece from
Sure.
there.
I agree with
Uh,
that.
you know, talking I'm not sure what value comes from, well, first of all, a 3 or 4 or 6 hour program at all, right? That's not enough to really have any type of meaningful change on behavior. Reinforcing for people the sense of being a victim, again, without providing the what do you do, right? It's just like punishing, not the same, but if we use a punishment, if someone is sanctioned for something and we never talk about what do you do differently, how do you prevent this again in the future, we're missing our ability to really shape behavior. If we tell someone society is unfair, and society is unfair in a lot of ways, right, and people have real reasons to feel that, but how do we manage that, how do we cope with that? And so if all we're doing is saying, you're getting a raw deal, and there are criminogenic needs, there are risks, this person has a real likelihood of reoffending, and we don't do anything to sort of address their needs, then maybe we're setting them up, you know?
I think so. So one more program I want to ask you before I move on to the next topic, because it's also very big in correctional institutions, are NA and AA based models. I mean, these are like everywhere. A lot of people are mandated to take them. You get a lot of credit for taking them. But from everything I know about human psychology, criminal psychology in particular, in programming, NA and AA are not going to address the fundamental issues involved in criminal behavior. Would that be an accurate statement? Like, what do you think about AA in prisons?
Yeah. So again, I think it's really good that we have resources available to people, um, activities, supplemental, right?
But wouldn't it
Support.
be better? You've said that a couple times, but wouldn't it be better if we had available to them the types of programs that are actually going to help them with their lives when they get out of prison, rather than putting them through programs that aren't going to do that and giving them a false sense of security?
100%.
Okay,
100%, right? Anytime I'm like, oh, well, it's good that we have activities, that does not negate the need for real meaningful intervention, right? But when intervention time is over, right? When group time is over, how are you spending your time? And so
sure.
if having a support group makes me feel better, okay. But expecting that AA or NA, again, alone, right? That just going to AA, NA alone for someone who has a likelihood of reoffending is going to change their behavior. There's no evidence to suggest that.
See, when you
Zero.
say I think you're right. My problem is this: when you say AA or NA alone isn't going to do it, because I can already hear the people in correction saying, well, it's not AA and NA alone. We have all these other programs. The problem is none of the programs are evidence-based. None of them are addressing criminogenic needs. And even the ones with a proper philosophy aren't implemented properly. They don't have what you would call therapeutic integrity. So I just don't want anybody listening to think they've heard the escape clause because
Yes.
you've
No, no.
said, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want, oh, no, we have all these things, because they don't.
Yeah, and let's be clear, AA was like developed for middle-aged white men,
Yes.
right? I mean,
Middle class, middle-aged white
no,
men. How about
yes,
that?
yes, yes, who had like very different situations going on. Like it wasn't designed for people in prison who oftentimes don't fit that stereotype of who it was initially designed for.
Okay, so
Yep.
we've addressed how the programs address criminogenic needs. Now, what about and maybe I should have asked this first. It's kind of hard because they all kind of go together, but the risk need responsivity model, because that is
Mhm.
the model, right? Like that's the main one that has been shown to work. So, I
Yeah.
just want to say before I go on to, I just want to mention the criminogenic needs we talked about in Andrews and Banta's book, the Psychology of Criminal Conduct. They said that they did a survey of 171 correctional practitioners and asked them to name 3 criminogenic needs, which is the fundamental concept in criminal rehabilitation, and none of them can do it. I tried that. I asked my drug counselor in prison if he could name 3 criminogenic needs. He didn't even know what they were. So I just want to say that, but sorry to interrupt, but I forgot to mention that.
I will say, ask about dynamic risk, and maybe they know that, giving a little bit of
Well,
benefit.
well, when we get to risk need responsivity model, let me tell you this: that in Connecticut they have, I think it's the TPAI, which measures static risks. And I'm getting a little bit into the weeds here, because a dynamic risk is something that's amenable to change, whereas static risks can't. Static risks are your age, time you committed your first crime, your race, your gender, whatever. And that's what we measure here in Connecticut. So I don't think that would have made much of a difference. But I got a little ahead. So what is the risk need responsivity model?
Yeah, so Andrews and Banta, along with Paul Gendreau and other researchers back in the late 80s, early 90s, started really looking at what's the difference between these programs that can have an effect on recidivism or do reduce recidivism versus those that don't, right?
Yeah,
Not all treatment is equal. We've established that there's some really bad treatment out
sure.
there. And so from this early research, they developed a set of principles, which actually I think are like 16 or 18, depending on how you count, but have been boiled down into this risk need responsivity framework. And in its simplest terms, this framework would say, and the evidence is supportive of this. One is that we need to make sure that we're reserving our more intensive services for people that need them, right? For people that have a higher risk of recidivism. If someone is low risk, get them out of the system, right? Let's sort of hands off as much as possible. So one, better identify who we're providing services to and matching them on that level of risk. Second, target the criminogenic needs, right? Which is what we just talked about. So assess someone, figure out what their dynamic risk or their criminogenic needs are, and then target those for change. If I don't have a drug problem, I don't need to be in drug treatment, even if I was caught selling drugs,
Yeah.
right? If that's not my problem, that I don't need that intervention. So that's the need piece of it. So that's sort of what do we target? And then the third piece of it, responsivity, is really about acknowledging how individuals respond to treatment. So there's general responsivity, which is the idea of using a behaviorally based intervention, that generally speaking, people respond better to that than other
So
approaches.
it's applicable to all inmates or all the high
That's
risk
right.
inmates, right?
And you know what? It's applicable outside of corrections,
Sure.
right? Behavioral approaches to behavior change are preferred if we're talking about weight loss, smoking cessation, et cetera. So that's general responsivity. Specific responsivity is then really about individual differences in learning styles, right? Making sure that we match people up to facilitators, to services that meet their individual characteristics. So if you have someone who has been severely traumatized, don't assign them to a case manager who's going to make that trauma worse, right? We used to say don't assign them to anyone confrontational, but none of our case managers should be confrontational. If you have someone who has a lot of anxiety, to the point where it's sort of incapacitating their ability to participate in a group, then maybe we work with them individually instead of within a group setting. And so sort of breaking down, Ed Latessa would say, take away those barriers, right, that would might keep someone from being successful in treatment, right, in that intervention.
Okay, so you mentioned being non-confrontational. Now, I think that when you say we don't want to be confrontational, what you mean is different from, I think, what most people would take that to mean. So when I use the term confrontational in the context of programming, I mean when somebody is clearly doing something wrong, I bring it to their attention, mention it to them. If they start rationalizing, I would debate them on the issue to show them how they're rationalizing or contradicting themselves. When you say don't be confrontational, that's not what you're talking about. Am I right about that?
Correct. Yeah, I'm talking about a more aggressive
Yeah.
confrontation.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to get just so people really can understand this stuff, because this stuff is really important. It's really important to me. So how long have you been in this field, addressing this type of issue?
Yeah, since the late 90s. So
Okay.
20 years.
Okay. So in your experience, because I've read numbers, I just want to see what you say. Are most prisons equipped to implement all the things we've talked about? So we're talking the core correctional practices, the risk need responsivity model, cognitive behavioral therapy, addressing the criminogenic needs. Are most prisons or correctional institutions equipped for this type of stuff?
So I'm a researcher, right? So I don't like to generalize without data, but what I will say is based on my visits to prisons, my assessments of programs, we're failing miserably. Are
Okay.
they?
I've actually read in a who is it by? I want to say it was Francis Cullen and Paul Gendro. I'm not positive, but I believe that they said it's 1 in 10. That 1 in 10 correctional facilities is actually set up to succeed in the way that we're talking about.
That's probably not far off. I will say, I don't know what year they would have said that offhand. There are pockets where things are improving,
Okay.
but the improvement has still been, there's so much work to be done. There's so much work
A
to be done.
ton.
Like, we're failing people.
Yeah. And a big problem is you can have a lot of great sounding programming, and you can say this is our mission statement. This is, our goals, our vision, and these are our programs. But what I tell people, it's a lot like the prison menu. Turkey a la king probably sounds like a very delectable meal, but put it in front of the average person, he's not going to eat it. So they can put
Yeah.
whatever they want as part of the advertisement or propaganda. Doesn't mean that's what's actually going on. Well, we've got a
Yeah.
little
Well,
more time. Go ahead. Go ahead.
sorry, I just add to that because even if it is as good as it sounds, the reality is few people have access to it. Right. So even where we do have those pockets where they're doing really genuinely good work, the numbers being served are so small relative to the need that it's, like, again, failing people.
Drastically failing, right? Okay, so we got a little more time, so I want to ask you about juvenile crime, especially because in my home state, there's a big, I don't know how much of a problem it is, but it's a political issue about juvenile crime. And you basically have two sides. You have those on the left who say, oh, you want to charge, you don't want to charge kids as adults. Basically very lenient, very what they say is program orientated. I'm doubtful about the efficacy of the program. They talk about beyond rehabilitation, social programs, welfare, whatever, that type of stuff. And then on the right, they basically say, no, you got to be strict, you got to be tough on crime. And to me, they're both missing the important elements. One is that juvenile offenders aren't like other kids. They don't respond to the same incentives. I know I was one. So if you tell me, well, listen, you can go hang out with your pals, we're going to let you go to the movies or the ball game. I don't want to go to a freaking ball game. I want to go out and break into cars. You know what I mean? And if there's no penalty and I know I can get away with it, I'm going to continue. But at the same time, just locking me up isn't going to do anything either. So I think you do need the threat of punishment, but there also is, and this is what I want your take really on, programming that's been shown to be overwhelmingly effective with juvenile offenders. And I think you know what I'm talking about. So I don't even want to say it. I want you to be the one to say it. What programs are known to be extraordinarily effective with juvenile offenders?
Well, multi-systemic therapy is
That's
what
it.
you're referring to,
That's
because
it.
it really consistently has the strongest effects. And it's really looking at the family, right? It's looking at the system rather than just the individual.
Yeah, the former chief juvenile prosecutor in the state, Fran Carino, he was in Connecticut, was a chief juvenile prosecutor. And in correspondence with me, he told me, yes, he said, we use that in Connecticut, but probably not enough. And so for people listening, I just want them to understand that I don't want anybody to throw children away. You know what I mean? Like say, oh, look, this kid's a criminal, lock him up. But at the same time, I don't want someone saying, oh, look, give him a hug. And no one, I'm being hyperbolic, obviously, but let's just let them go. You do have to hold them accountable, but give them the resources to teach them how to be responsible human beings. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, the truth is the risk need responsivity model applies to juveniles as much as it does to adults.
Yes.
Part of it is, from my perspective, we need to do a better job of determining who to divert out of the system. And we need to divert more people out of the system, right? There are many, many
Yeah.
people under correctional supervision, whether as an adult or a juvenile, that don't need to be. With juveniles, especially, the further in they get, the worse those outcomes become, right? So if we
Yeah.
can start doing a better job of diverting out, I think that's critical for those kids that can't be diverted out, right? The kids who's like, forget the baseball game, I want to go, carjack someone. Those are the kids, again, we need to be focusing on. Those are the kids that need resources, that need support, the families that need the support. Kids are tough. Kids are really tough, right?
Very.
The good news is a lot of kids will grow out of it.
Yeah.
As you know, a lot
Yeah.
of kids, you get into the mid-20s and things start to come together. But if you've spent that entire time period really kind of being a problem and creating problems and causing harm and never experiencing consequences, that's scary.
Very much so. Okay. Is there anything that I left out? Anything I should have asked that you think needs to be said about the subject?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, when people ask me, what do we need to do differently or what do we need to do better? It's much of what we've just talked about. I think one of the issues that maybe we didn't talk about is just getting reserve prison only for those that need it.
Yeah.
Make it the exception and not the rule, right? Because if we do that, if we reduce our prison population, which I firmly believe we can do, then we can better utilize the resources that we have, right? That allows us to provide better interventions, to provide better programs, to provide better services. And so it's difficult for me to imagine really being able to drastically change the nature of correctional rehabilitation in our programs with the number of people that we have in prison.
The system's overwhelmed, right? There's just too many people.
There's too many people and not enough resources.
Perfect. Yep. Okay. So do you have a website? Is there anywhere people can find you? A book that you have that they could buy?
I do have a book, actually. Along with Ed Latessa and Shelley Johnson, we have a book called What Works and Doesn't in Reducing Recidivism. I think it's a pretty easy read.
It is, and it's great. It's a great book.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really, really good to write. And you can get that on Amazon. I think it's available there. I have a website, deborahkoetzle.com. Don't judge me if you go to it. It's still a work in progress. So I need to hire someone to help me. But yeah, would love to have the chance to connect again and answer any questions
Great,
you might
because
have.
you were wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. All right, folks, for now, this is the Rational Egoist, Michael Liebowitz. I'm signing off. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.